All right. Hebrew, it scared you. Miss Agnes shot up like, whoa. Hebrews chapter 11. We're in the Faith Hall of Fame, the Hall of Fame of Faith, the Hall of Faith, whatever you want to call it. It's been called many different things, but basically what we're looking at isn't just a single verse definition of faith, but a chapter-long definition of faith. And what we saw last week, we began in the first 7 verses. And in the first 7 verses, we're talking about Abel, we're talking about Enoch, and we're talking about Noah. And it's exemplifying the idea that faith believes the invisible. And so we looked at that last week, and now we're getting to the main exhibit. If you were walking down a museum, and you see all these small exhibits, and then a museum will sometimes have one big, major exhibit that all the signs are pointing to, that's where we are in the chapter. Because tonight we're going to look at the section on Abraham. And Abraham is the largest section of the chapter, and rightfully so. Because he is the father of faith, if you will. You go back to the book of Romans chapter 4, long section exemplifying the faith of Abraham. And so that's what we're doing here. And so we're going to look at verses 8 through 22 and possibly move on to Moses, depending on if we have time, starting in verse 23. But let's read it first, and then we'll go back up and we'll break it down. And so verse 8, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Okay, 3 paragraphs there. So let's try to break that down. Let's go back to verse 8. And we're talking about the father of the faithful, Abraham. And it's fitting. It's fitting and that this section concentrates on him and on the things that he went through. And what we're seeing here from verses 8 through 22, the first 7 verses, faith believes the invisible. These verses here, 8 through 22, we can add another piece to the definition that biblical faith beholds the impossible. Biblical faith beholds the impossible. And so we begin by talking about Abraham leaving his father's home. He's leaving his father's home. And where is he going? Did he know? He had no idea. He had no idea. I hate not knowing where I'm going. I hate it. I hate it. I thought, man, that we were in hog heaven when MapQuest came out and we would print out 5 pages of directions, and we're sitting there reading, we're supposed to be looking at the road, but we're reading the map, the map's in the steering wheel between, 10 and 2, holding on, and I thought that was wonderful. Now it's even better. It's even better because you can know exactly where you're going as long as you have signal, that being the key, as long as you have signal. But did Abraham know where he was going? He had no idea. He had no idea. He was just going, knowing that the Lord would eventually show him. And that's what we find. This is all going back to Genesis chapter 12. You're going to go to a land that I will show you. And this isn't just an ordinary trial of faith that Abraham had to go through. He had to give up what he had in one hand. He knew what he had in Mesopotamia. He knew what his father had that he would inherit. He knew what he had. He saw it. He felt it. He touched it. He experienced it daily. And he had to give that up to go to the unknown. To go to the unknown. To go to where it is afar off. And sometimes biblical faith means we're going to act not knowing necessarily where we are headed. And not knowing what the future may hold. And sometimes all we can do is just obey and trust in the voice of God. And that's what Abraham teaches us. Now in verse 8, it says he was to receive an inheritance. And this idea, the reason he starts out with this is because this wouldn't be lost on the audience that he's talking to. Remember, these are Jewish Christians who, because of persecution, what have they been doing? What have some of them already done? They've gone back to Moses. And they're looking around and seeing what they have and that they're losing it. That was part of the persecution they're going through. They're losing what they have. They're losing sometimes even their own homes, their own dwelling places. And for what? For promises? For promises they haven't fully received yet? For the unknown, that they don't know what's going to happen to them? Do you see the parallel there? And so it's no wonder that he begins right here with Abraham and this idea of Abraham leaving his inheritance behind, that which he had in his hand, that which he saw, experienced, knew, for a place he had no idea what was waiting. And so he surrenders his family's inheritance for God's promises, and he embraces the status of an immigrant. The status of an immigrant. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise. The word live there, we don't really get the full impact of the picture being painted here. The word live is paroikeo, and oiko or oikos would be a house, par alongside. But this word in some translations it's translated not live but sojourned, which is probably a little bit better translation than what the ESV has. In the Septuagint, you'll find it used as referring to a place or someone who is in a place that has zero ownership or citizenship. He was an immigrant. He lived as an immigrant. Abraham owned one piece of land in Canaan. What was it? Canaan. And what was that exactly for him? It was his grave. When Sarah died, he bought a grave. They wanted to give it to him. He said, no, I want to buy it. I want to make sure you know I own it. And that became his family grave. He is sojourning in the land that's promised to him, but he's living as an immigrant. The only thing he owns is his own grave. His own grave. And when he arrived there, God further tells him that the land's going to be not given to you, Abraham, but it's going to be given to who? It's his descendants. It's going to be his descendants. And when are they going to receive it? Over 400 years later. 400 years later. 4 centuries. And so for 4 centuries they're living now in a land that is not yet theirs. And this tells us another little piece we can add on to the puzzle of what is faith. Biblical faith trusts that God's promises will be fulfilled, even though not necessarily in our lifetime. God's promises will always come true. Biblical faith tells us that, but they may not come to pass in our lifetime. Now, Abraham's faith was not, let's don't get this mixed up, because sometimes we will. Sometimes it's easy to kind of mix some other materialistic kind of feelings in here, because Abraham's faith wasn't in eventually inheriting Canaan, because he never did inherit it. He didn't inherit it. But he continued instead to live in tents. And also Isaac, his son, did the same. Jacob did the same. And why would they do that? Because they were seeing past the physical, right? It wasn't about the land of Canaan. It was about the promise. The promise that one day they would inherit this city of God. That's what verse 10. He was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Was looking forward to is actually just one word in the original language, and it gives the idea of a absolute confidence of expectation. Here's his promise, and they expect it. And they are able to put all of their confidence in this expectation. And the tense is continuous. And so there's this continuous confidence and continuous expectation that they are going to receive this city, this inheritance from the Lord, knowing that there's a greater, even further down. The city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is who? God. Which tells me he's looking forward to something more than just Canaan, right? He knew. He knew there was something greater than even this inheritance that's promised. Now, we get a little aside to Abraham's story, because now we're going to focus on Sarah. We're going to focus on Sarah a little bit. And Sarah had a faith that believed in impossible promises. Impossible promises. Now, how old was Sarah when we're talking about right here? 90 years old. True or false? She's no longer at 90 years old fertile myrtle, right? I mean, she's far from being that. At 90, you're past the menopause stage, right? Absolutely. Barbara's laughing like, thank goodness. But you're past that stage. And so the idea of worrying about childbirth at the age of 90 isn't a concern. No. It's biologically impossible, right? Biologically impossible. So here's Sarah at the age of 90, and she is going to conceive this promised son. Now, you go back to Genesis 18. What was her reaction to that? She laughed. She laughed. And it was a derisive laughter if you look at the context of it. It's like, yeah, okay. Okay. Now, if you look at 18, verses 11 and 12 of the book of Genesis 18, 11, and 12, we won't take the time to go over there and read it. We got a long ways to go. But the narrator not only makes mention that she's past the age of conception, but they're no longer even being intimate in that way. Age just tends to slowly diminish. And when you reach an advanced age like that, and so here, of course, her natural reaction, right. Okay. And so she laughs. But despite her doubt, eventually, she believes the promise about Isaac. Why did she believe the promise?
God said it. Angels said it.
Because it came down from God, right? It's not about the promise. It's about the promise maker. It wasn't believing the promise, okay, I'm going to conceive a son at the age of 90. No, it was about the promise maker. It was about the one who promised it. Because she knew the source of the promise had always been faithful to them. And so again, okay, now we can add another little notch, another little link to the chain of this long definition of faith. Biblical faith believes impossible promises because of the reliability of the promise maker, and not the probability of the promise itself. Did you get that? Biblical faith believes the impossible promises because of the reliability of the promise maker, and not because of the probability of the promise itself. Okay. And so verse 12, therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants too many to count, basically. We hop back to chapter 2 and verse 16 of Hebrews. The audience we read are part of those descendants. They're part of those descendants. And so when God repeated his promise of descendants to the patriarch, remember Abraham's complaining because of his lack of a child? And of course, we go back to the story. We know what happens. Here, take Hagar. And that became a mess. And well, even before that, here, adopt Eleazar. And then Hagar and Ishmael. And then finally, God had to come down and say, hey, wait a minute. Quit trying to help me out. You're making a mess of things. Here's what's going to happen. And he explains it a little bit more. But he's complaining about his lack of a child. And God, do you remember, he tells him, you look up to the heavens. You look up to the heavens. You look up at the sky and you count the stars. If you're even able to count them, and your offspring will be just as numerous as the stars, as the grains of the sand. The Hebrew writer brings that in here as well. And even after Abraham, I know we're kind of skipping ahead a few verses here, but even after Abraham, it is shown how he's willing to sacrifice to God that child of promise, Isaac. God reaffirms his promise. And he tells him, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. Okay, so here's another link in our faith definition chain, if you want to call it that. Biblical faith believes that God will fulfill his promises far beyond our wildest imaginations. Biblical faith believes God will fulfill his promises far beyond our wildest imaginations. Now, as we go into this next paragraph here, the author kind of takes a breath and invites us to do the same so that we can maybe reflect on some of these things. And he begins to express some feelings on our true home as Christians. And so we actually, in these 3 verses or so, we catch a glimpse of the conclusion of the chapter in verses 39 and 40 already. And so he says, in the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the promise of land was just that. It was a promise. It remained without fulfillment in their lifetime. In fact, they lived with the promise in view. They died with the promise in view, they lived and died in faith because they understood that God's promises are so real that they greeted them. They already came true in the future, even though not in their lifetime. But the point here isn't about the delayed fulfillment. That's not the point. It's not about the delayed fulfillment. Because our author basically is saying in this paragraph, the pleasure and safety of a home, that's not what they valued most. That's not what they valued most. For example, the book of Hebrews tells us that if an earthly place to call home was what the patriarchs really wanted, then all of a sudden they would have referred to themselves differently. They would have referred to themselves differently. But in verse 13, they're strangers and exiles. They're strangers and exiles. A stranger in the land is basically a foreigner. You know, we're in a small town area. Everybody knows when someone moves in that they've never seen before. Right? If someone walks into the building you've never seen before, whispers start. Who is that? Where do they come from? Where do they live? Are they just visiting? Or are they just passing through? Why are they passing through? And what are they doing? It's small town life. Why? Because they're strangers. They're strangers. Exiles. We think of exiles as people who don't have a home because of whatever reason. Strangers and exiles. Now, they're referring to themselves as this, strangers and exiles. But where are they living during all this time? They're living in the promised land. And yet they're strangers and exiles in the land. Don't miss that. That's vital to understand. They are referring to themselves as strangers and exiles, even though they are living, residing in the land promised to them. But they are not the only ones. You flash forward several centuries to David, and you look at Psalm 39 and verse 12. David considered himself a sojourner, literally a guest, like all of my fathers. And here he is, not just living in the promised land, he's reigning as its king. And he still calls himself a guest, a sojourner, comparing himself to the patriarchs, just like my fathers. And so wherever Abraham went, and we can see this in his life as we read throughout Genesis, wherever he went, he was treated and incurred this stigma of being a stranger. Of being a stranger and a foreigner. You go back up to verse 9, and it says he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents. He's a foreigner, literally, a alatrios, a foreigner. You go back down to verse 13, and he uses for stranger and exile here the word xenos. Heard the word of late, probably xenophobia. Xenophobia is where we get it. It's the fear of what you call it. Not the candy bar. It's the fear of foreigners, right? Xenos. It uses the word xenos, and then parapidemos, strangers and exiles. And so you put these three Greek words together, and they're really synonyms with just a slightly different vantage point from each other. But it's basically all three are indicating someone who does not have full participation within a community. All three indicate someone living in a place where they do not have civil rights in that place. And the suggestion is that they do, however, have rights somewhere else. And so all three of those terms, referring to not having civil rights in the place they're living, but have it somewhere else. And this nuance here, here's the point that the author is getting at, that if here they are, the patriarchs, they're aliens, even in the promised land, even in Canaan, even though it was theirs by promise. So here's the question that we're supposed to be asking: where is their homeland? Where is their homeland? If it's not really in Canaan, which is the land of promise, where is it? Where is it? Now he says here, verse 15, they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out. They would have had the opportunity to return. So maybe, are they considering their old home? That would be Mesopotamia. Are they considering that their homeland? Because they can always go back there. That's not it, is it? That's not it. If they consider Canaan their true home, or their ultimate destination, all of a sudden they would have started putting down roots. They didn't do that. Of course, one of them did. Who did that? Abraham's group. Who put down roots? Lot. Lot did. He paid for it too, didn't he? Instead of living in tents like Abraham and then the descendants that would come later, Lot decided, hey, I'm going to have the pleasure and security of this life. I'm going to have pleasure and security of this life. Now, if Abel, Enoch, Noah, and now Abraham had been motivated by that, could they have had that? Absolutely, they could have had that. But they had a greater desire in life, right? Abraham had a greater desire in life. Their objective, their definition was different. And that goes back to what we read in verse 10, right? He was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Chapter 12 and verse 24 is going to be referred to and described as a heavenly city. But the nature of the city, and we're told here in verse 10, the nature of the city isn't its location. It's permanent. It's superior to the cities of the world, not because of where it's located, but because of who built it. Who's its architect? God. God's its builder. God is its architect. And so here the patriarchs are, they're seeking and they're desiring a better country. That's what we read in 14. That's what we read in verse 16. And this wasn't a hobby for them. This wasn't just a pastime, something to just take their mind off of things. This wasn't just insurance against some kind of damnation. This was the passion of their life. This was their main business of life, because they understood that its object was the only true source of blessing and the only true source of rest. We have a statement, right? We have a phrase, home is where? Home is where the heart is. Home is where the heart is. And their heart was with God. And because their heart was with God, God has prepared a better country, a heavenly city, where the faithful will dwell with Him forever. And it's a city. It's the city where Jesus has gone as our forerunner to prepare for us, for our arrival. A city that holds our citizenship now. A city that we call home. And those type of people whose heart is with God, whose home is there, those kind of people, God is not ashamed to be associated with. They were strangers and exiles on the earth. The patriarchs confessed the Most High as their God. And because of that confession, God was not ashamed to be their God. And it calls our minds back to, again, chapter 2, toward the beginning of the book, where he reminds us that the Son, Jesus, is unashamed to call us brothers, but instead acknowledges the righteous before God's throne. They confessed their home to be the city of God. We as Christians, and those Jewish Christians who were really on the verge of leaving, going back to Moses, they're being encouraged to confess their home to be the city of God and to hold fast to that confession, because that means God gladly confesses then that we belong to Him. And so the homes that we're talking about here, and this whole idea gives us yet another link, another aspect, another view of what biblical faith is. And that is that biblical faith always looks forward and never looks backward. The Hebrew Christians of the first century to whom this was written, all they knew of what was going on around them was danger, was troubles. Everywhere they looked was some kind of trap that they could fall in. Persecution after persecution after persecution. And they're struggling to see past that. Because that persecution was so big, it was like a blinder to the future for them. And they could not see past it. It was becoming a bigger and bigger struggle to see past it. But the author here is encouraging them, you keep looking past it. Because when you look past it, you see the power of God. You see the power of God's presence. And you see what is awaiting you on the other side. And don't turn back to the place from which you came. You know, the wilderness generation did that. And they're brought up time and time again throughout this book as what not to do. If you want to say there's a big bad in the book, they're the exemplification of it. Because they wanted to stop, leave, go back to Egypt. Because, it's so much better under slavery than trusting in God to bring you through, right? Don't do that. Don't be like the wilderness generation. They hadn't reached their destination yet. But faith required them to acknowledge the reality of their objective. That it is true, it is going to happen, even if they don't see it in this lifetime. In other words, he is holding up Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob here as sojourners, foreigners, reminding them to live like they lived. And that kind of faith will be rewarded. The next paragraph, beginning verse 17, is probably the ultimate in Abraham's story, the ultimate event. And that's the sacrifice of Isaac. The sacrifice of Isaac. We find that in Genesis 22, verses 1 through 19. Now, God commanded him to take his son, which could have been one of three, right? His only son, meaning biological, well, that knocks Eleazar out, so that's one of two. The one you love. The special one, the one of promise. So there's no doubt which son. He's talking about Isaac. He could have had plenty of reasons to say no. In fact, one of the reasons to say no was God's own integrity to his own word. Because here's the son of promise. All these generations are going to come through him. And you want me to kill him? Are you going back on your word? Was your word a lie? But Abraham's faith was such that if Isaac had died, it wouldn't prove God a liar. It wouldn't prove God a failure. Abraham obeyed. He goes to the mountain. He's prepared to offer his son on the altar. And verse 19 tells us why, doesn't it? His faith was such that, okay, either God's going to stop me and preserve Isaac's life, or he's going to raise Isaac from the dead. Because he made a promise. And God keeps his promises. He had given him a son when Abraham was as good as dead, verse 12 tells us. And since death wasn't the last word for Abraham, Abraham was 100% confident, 100% sure that it wasn't going to be the last word for Isaac either. And so he obeyed. He tells his servants, do you remember? I think it's about Genesis 22, it's about verse 4 or 5. Tells his servants, you stay here with the donkey. Me and the lad. I am the boy. We're going to go over there. We're going to worship. And then who's going to come back? We will come back. There's confidence there. There's confidence there, even in the Genesis account. We will come back to you. That's how certain he was that God's promise concerning Isaac was going to stand. And so, okay, here's another link. Another aspect. Biblical faith does what God says to do, even though it may appear to contradict what God has promised. Biblical faith does what God says to do, even though it may appear to contradict what God has promised. Now, verse 20, we flip over very quickly to Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And after this long bout with Abraham, where it's like, again, we talk about this chapter as if it's a museum a lot of times. And so here's exhibit, and then this huge spotlight on Abraham. And then Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, they're almost like little asterisks in the text here. But Isaac lived by faith like his father. And we're told in verse 20 that he invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. And he did so with confidence. He did so with confidence. He understood, he was confident that God was going to follow through on all of the promises that he made to Abraham. And that confidence leads him to bless his sons as well. But the blessings is an act of faith. Because Isaac himself cannot give the recipient what God had promised. And so by blessing the sons, he is again showing his faith in God that he's going to rely on God to put the blessing into effect. And that's the same thing we see in verse 21 with Jacob and Joseph. Very similar. Jacob blessed Joseph's sons because he's confident that they're going to inherit God's promises through Jacob, who is about to die. Now, verse 22 focuses on Joseph. Now, the life of Joseph, it's providence exemplified. You look at the life of Joseph, and there's so many major events in Joseph's life that we could hone in on, and we could really pay attention to, and say, wow, look at Joseph. I mean, think about this. We think of Joseph being sold into slavery, and he goes to Potiphar's house, and look at the faith he showed there, and then being accused of rape and sexual, some kind of sexual thing. He's thrown into prison, and again, his faith faith never wavers. And then he finally gets out. He's brought to power and all of these things. What does the author of Hebrews focus on, though? By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Isn't that amazing? Joseph lived such an adventurous life, you could say, an eventful life, and yet he's concentrated on giving his descendants very clear instructions not to bury him in Egypt, but to bury him where? In his home in Canaan. And again, that instruction, the reason why it's spotlighted here is because it is absolutely full and pregnant with his conviction of God's faithfulness. Exodus, the events of Exodus and Moses and all that, 400 years in the future. He's looking through time to 4 centuries' time. And yet he still has hope. As he's dying, his faith makes his hope a firm reality. And the reason it's chosen here is to show this audience of Jewish Christians to hold on. Just hold on, because your destiny lies where God has promised. Our author could have looked at anything within Joseph's life as an example of his faithfulness. But he literally chose the very last thing Joseph did as he looked with certainty into an unknown future with the expectation that God will do what he said he will do. And so one last link before we close, and that is biblical faith entrusts the future to the Lord. Confident that one's own death does not mean the death of God's promises. I'll say that one more time. Biblical faith entrusts the future to God, confident that even their own death will not mean the death of God's promise. Okay. Verse 23, we're going to jump to Moses, but we're almost out of time, so we can either go long, or we can probably end on time after the invitation song. What number is that, Richard?
891.
891 is going to be the song of invitation. And there may be someone here who's yet to put on Christ in baptism, and yet you're at the point of faith where you desire to do that. Faith, repentance, make that confession, and then be immersed. We want to help you do that. It may be that you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters in Christ for whatever reason. We want to do that for you right now. Won't you come? As together we stand and sing.
The voice of the Savior says, "Come."